actually also wanted to start out with a disclaimer, being that I do not claim to speak for all LGBT people in the arts, because both these fields are very large, so I'm just speaking in my personal capacity as a visual artist and writer. So I'll be talking about three things. My favorite is content regulation in Singapore, because, the MD is my best friend. Hello, MD officials gathered to the audience whom I may not know already. Second, the effect of this regulation on queer artists as well as the queer community at large. And lastly, I've also been given the task by MIAP to introduce Queer Futures, which is a project that we are launching today. Okay, so as I was putting together this presentation, one of the things I did was I posed this question to a number of people in the creative industry who happen to be queer. What are your concerns with regard to the future of LGBT art makers and art content in Singapore? So I'll start by sharing some of the responses. This came from Ovidia, it's a novelist, Ovidia, right? She says that, I hope we're successful enough so that it's no longer necessary to talk about LGBT artsmiths any more than left-handed ones. So that we can take for granted that LGBT people exist the same way we take for granted left-handed people exist. Look at that one. Oh, sorry. Like I said, I'm trying to deflect attention away from myself. Yes, and for her, it's relevant to the art creation because if you can accept us, then you can accept what's made. Next, Cyril Wong, who's a poet, also known as the first gay professional poet in Singapore. He said, well, his immediate concern was the issue of the rising visibility of religious fundamentalism in Singapore. And he also countered that with the rising visibility of our community to sort of counter that. This one, when she sent it to me, she said she was angry and drunk when she wrote it. This is Jacqueline Chan, she's a screenwriter, and she said, don't feel that she'll be forced to write the same old shit for locals, which includes X, Y, Z, ABC, and that she'll always, sort of be in fear of being sued or jailed for posting something political in a cartoon, whereas the people who write journals for a song will never have to live with that persecution. I wish Jackie was here so I could pump her up. To remind people I did not say this, okay. So what struck me about the first two responses was the lack of distinction for Ovidia and Cyril's classification of themselves as person and artist. And of course with Cyril's, there's also a symbiotic relationship between visibility and acceptance. So I think for those of us who create work that revolve around sexuality, we understand the importance of allowing people to access this content. And of course, Jacqueline's not so subtle allusion to censorship. If art is a means of cultural production, visibility of queerness, or the lack thereof, not only reflects, but also reinforces the status quo with regards to our lives as queer people in Singapore. So, on that note, I'm going to be relating something that happened at last year's indignation to use as a departure point to bring up some questions with regards to this topic. So this is a film still from Ruby. It was something that was supposed to be screened at last year's indignation at an exhibition that I curated. It's by Alicia Lim. She's a Canadian artist who grew up in Singapore. The film is actually, if you go back to the image, this is pretty much the whole 52 seconds. It's a little plasticine girl, and there's a voiceover talking about the narrator's experience of having a crush on another girl at the age of 15. There's absolutely no sex, no violence, no nudity, no foul language, no drug references, no reference to horror. I listed this because these are the things on the MBA website. In fact, when Alicia submitted this to another film festival in New York, she submitted it under the children's category. Which brings me to my point. When I submitted this film for classification to the MBA, it got an NC-16. Seriously, it's available on YouTube. Please go and watch it. It's ridiculous. classification. A classification may not sound like a big deal, like so what, right? But I think, as some of you may know, any film that is rated NC-16 or above requires a $10,000 security deposit before they screen. So anyone who is screening in their personal capacity, myself, basically, clearly I could not afford that deposit. And as it is very often with the MDA, because despite the fact that the exhibition was in August and I started the licensing conversation in May, they only got back to me with the classification 2 days before the show. So there was no time for me to sort of figure out how to raise that money either. Okay, so I asked for an explanation with regards to this rating. I cited the fact that it was submitted to a children's film festival in another country. And I got a lot of vague responses from customer feedback regarding homosexuality and community norms. When I asked for more specific feedback, giving the example of the lesbian character on Moulmein High, I don't know how many of you remember this, but there was an openly lesbian character on a mainstream television show made in Singapore a number of years back. And I asked whether that was acceptable because she was portrayed as being dysfunctional. I was told I would get a response, and 2 follow-ups, and 10 months later, I don't think I'm going to get a response. So I bring this up for 2 reasons. I'd like to bring up specific concerns I have with how art is regulated by the state firstly. Censorship in Singapore is clearly not new, and it seems as though it is easing up. But I personally believe that the state's, or rather the MDA's claim of moving towards co-regulation rather than censorship is much more insidious and has been created to breed a culture of self-censorship, within which content creators operate based on fear. So I have 2 reasons for this. One of it is that $10,000 deposit discriminates specifically against private individuals and small companies who cannot afford to put it up, and more importantly, cannot afford to lose it. This discrimination ensures that only established institutions are allowed to contribute or not contribute to cultural narratives of queer community. And as we know, many of these established institutions are either government-funded or they're commercial entities. So it's really not in their benefit, it doesn't benefit them to rock the boat. Secondly, the MDA's claim of moving towards co-regulation, sorry, it's ridiculous, in which content makers are allowed to take their own initiative to declare their content concerns is, to me, a big farce. The MDA's position on homosexuality is clear, and the guidelines for artists to declare their content concerns are very precise. Themes of homosexuality come under the same section in the declaration form that houses themes of suicide, child abuse, and terrorism. To add, in the MDA's last annual report, it has stated that it will, quote-unquote, not hesitate to take firm regulatory action against companies which contravene the licensing conditions of the content guidelines. So in short, this is not co-regulation. This is basically the MDA now wanting to screen all the work themselves, getting you to do it, and then punishing you if you don't do it their way. It's actually a very good model for efficiency if you're looking at it from the working point of view. Okay, so the questions that came up as I was putting together this presentation were basically the following. How does the lack of queer visibility in our mainstream media affect young queer Singaporeans? I have a friend who's 19 who actually put it very eloquently. She said, if my life was a film, I would not be old enough to see it. It's funny, but it's also quite sad, and I think it felt very devastating to me at that point in which, she said it. I mean, what does having... Oh, it's ridiculous. Second one. How does our lack of visible local role models affect our relationship to our country? So besides the rhetoric of you can't be what you can't see, even today, I think most of the queer content that we can and do access comes from other countries. So I'm not sure how this affects our relationship with this country in which we live. I would be hard-pressed to believe that it doesn't. To what extent have local queer artists need to self-censor in an effort to work the system, and in that process, how much of our history, how much of our narrative, how much of our culture has been lost? To what extent should artists who are critical of the state accept state funding? This one is, it's not Bible, I think that's one projecting, I'm putting it in. So to what extent are we being hypocrites, having discussions via state platforms, state-sponsored vendors, and state infrastructure? It's almost like sort of biting the hand that feeds. Second last one, which I think is very important, how can artists and performers employ their respective skills to reach out to the queer community? I'd like to add to that point, how can we do that without manufacturing new hegemonies, manufacturing new forms of hierarchy that oppress us within the community, whether it's based on gender identity, personal choice, etc. And the last one, must creative content be packaged to please mass audiences in order to be effective? So it's either art or activism compromised in an effort to reach the wider public. As I was putting together these questions, Ivan Hing actually got back to me with a response to the question, and a lot of parallels, I think, in what he had to say. So, what makes us the community? How wide is it embrace? How do we acknowledge and inspire diversity? And I think the most important one is how can we work together towards social, cultural, and political change. So the artist not just as someone that makes something to put on your wall or someone who is there to entertain you, but what are our roles as content makers in creating social, cultural, and political change. That was the end of my presentation, but I want to be asked task to introduce Queer Futures, another Singapore conversation. So this is a project that's going to be ongoing for a year, and you are all invited to participate. It was inspired by numerous things. One, Gavin, who's over there, who's an artist friend of mine, was interested in co-running workshops for the local community. Second, I wanted to move away from the viewer-spectator format that exhibitions provide. Third, of course, the theme of indignation, which is faith in the future. And of course, you can tell by the title, I was very, very, very moved and inspired by our Singapore conversation. What is happening to us? Okay. So I'll just let you know what the project's about. If you're a queer person, you're Singaporean or Singapore-based or living in Singapore, what you have to do is write a short letter to your future self. Okay? Thinking about the following things. If you had one wish as a queer person, what would it be? In an ideal Singapore, what would your future look like? How has living in Singapore affected your projections of your own future? And if you could pose one question to your future self, what would you ask? You can send it to that email address. We also have flyers next to the food. The project will culminate in an invitation to members of Parliament to engage with our community concerns raised via this project. So we are actually participating in the Singapore conversation, even though we weren't really invited. Accompanying the letter writing exercise, I'm also hoping after August to organize bi-monthly art workshop sessions for members of the community who might be interested. Work made during these workshops will revolve around people's hopes for the future. And all this work will be collated again at Indignation 2014 in a community show.